I greet you, dear students of ICT and IS, once again. This is our second pre-recorded lecture, but however, it should be our third lecture session overall. It follows an introductory lecture to research methods, which we've had Friday the 28th, and I hope it was a good discussion. This particular pre-recorded lecture looks at research design. Essentially planning for your research. So I hope we shall have a good discussion after this to unpack anything that we may not have understood. So we start by understanding design itself so that we can know what exactly this pre-recorded session is about. Like anything, especially anything major in life, we have to plan. We have to make a plan in order to ensure that we don't get lost along the way, we don't lose our objective, we don't lose ourselves. Research itself is quite daunting, I must say. It's quite a daunting area to attempt, and one can easily lose themselves, and one can very easily give up what they're trying to do. So the design process, coming up with a research design, helps you to keep track of where you're going. As you're carrying out your research, as you're reading literature, you read so many things and you see this person went this direction and you'll be thinking, should I go that direction? I was originally thinking this direction. So the research design will help to keep you on track. So essentially, what is design? It is basically what it is a researcher come making decisions or making defining certain decisions that will guide their research. We shall discuss how these decisions shall be made in the slides to follow. So these decisions then create a plan. A plan which will help you achieve your objectives. Okay? That is essentially what a research design is. Like I said earlier, what we want to do is to avoid wasting time or money. That is essentially what we want. We don't want to get lost on a particular topic, on a decision of what exactly we want to do. So that research design then becomes a blueprint which guides us as we move along the way. So the researcher essentially is going to come up with a plan on paper. This researcher can share it with a supervisor, or you must share it with your supervisor, who then guides you on the steps you need to take if you've missed out something, if there's something that is not clear. And these things are extremely important. I have time and time again read through so much, quite a bit of proposals and concept papers, and you find somebody is maybe a bit lost on what exactly it is they want to do, what their research entails. So the research design essentially is the beginning process for you to start planning, so that when you begin to write that concept paper, that proposal, and eventually your book, you're not lost. You keep in mind what it is you intended to do. Now, this research process also involves you determining how you're going to collect your data, where you're going to collect that data from, how many people, in which context, then eventually how you're going to analyze this data. So in a nutshell, when we're looking at research design, we're looking at that skeleton that will guide your research. So this is at the beginning process. It's really at the beginning process of your research. Some guiding questions. How do we come up with the research design? Here on this slide, we have a few guiding questions that can help you come up with your research design and eventually write your proposal and your book. First is what it is you want to study. What are you trying to study? There are many things that you will encounter as an ICT or an IS student. We can study so many things. I might say, I want to study the behavior of girls in secondary schools, performance levels, let us say. I want to study performance levels of the girl child, especially during this COVID-19 era. What is the performance of this girl, of the girl child or the girl student or pupil in a school? How has the pandemic affected them? That may be my study. If I'm in social science, if I'm in ICT, I may want to look at issues of governance. I may want to look at issues of ICT alignment. I may want to look at enterprise in the field of enterprise architecture. In the field of IS, I may want to look at human-computer interaction and context-aware research. There is so much I can look at. So what is the study about? That would be the question. Then why do they study? So here, this is where you're giving justification. And when we give justification, we don't want to say, oh, I want to do this research because I don't know. You may not know, but others already know. So that is not essentially research. So you're looking back at literature. What is those who have studied this area? Where are they saying is the issue? Where are the issues that we need to be concerned about? Okay. Where will the study be carried out? What type of data is going to be picked? Are we picking qualitative data? Are we picking quantitative data? All these questions are essentially questions that rise up when we are talking about research design. What style of report will be prepared? Yeah, what style of report? How am I going to write? And so on and so forth. Now, when you look at those questions that design science poses, essentially, those questions help to guide your proposal writing and eventually your book. If you look at the very first set of questions which we had, they are the same as what we see here on this slide. These first three questions essentially help us write our first chapter. If we're looking at what is it I'm trying to study, I'm introducing my subject, and that's what chapter 1 does, introduces the subject. What is it what am I trying to study? What is the research problem? We are going to look at problem identification later on. What is the research problem that has been identified by so many other writers? Then what then would be my objective for doing this research? And as you think about these things, then you think about, oh, then this is the type of data that I want to pick as opposed to this type of data. Remember when we talked about justification of why should we do this research? This is when we're looking at what prior research has been done as far as that problem area that you're talking about. Who pointed it out? When we say how do we want to do the research, we are basically talking about methodology. Are we going to use case study? Are we going to use design science? Are we going to use case study research? What essentially are we trying? What method shall we use to collect this data? Eventually, we shall talk about what was found and how we analyze the data. This section, the final section, this would be our final chapter. You'll excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. Now, research design can be split into 4 phases, essentially. And all of these phases help us, still direct us to the questions that we had earlier, but in a more organized fashion. The first one is the sampling design. So here we are making a decision on what essentially it is we want to observe. What is it we want to study? So I'll give an example. If, let's say, an IS student says that I would like to develop a mobile application, maybe to support expectant mothers in either rural areas or urban, depending. Maybe it's, let's say urban areas. Then the first, for this student to be able to come up with this application, the student would then have to ask the questions of what do I need to observe to help me come up with this mobile application? What is it within the context of an urban area do I need to observe to help me come up with this? When I'm evaluating it, what is it that I need to observe? Essentially, what is it that I need to observe so that I evaluate this application effectively? If it is an ICT student, maybe who would like to validate a certain framework which maybe carries out alignment or anything like that, or I want to design a framework, then the question is, what are those things in the context that I need to observe to help me build a framework? If I'm talking about alignment, what are those variables that I need to observe that talk about alignment, ICT alignment? What are they that I need to observe? Then we talk about observation design. That is essentially the conditions or the context in which I am trying to design. I'm trying to observe the different variables. When we talk, then we come to statistical design. Here we want to know how many subjects are we going to observe. Are we observing artifacts? Are we observing people? Are we observing an organization? What is it that, how many of these? If I'm, let's say, looking at e-learning systems, am I going to look at only one e-learning system in one context, or am I going to look at one e-learning system but which is in several contexts? Those are the questions essentially that. So the final one is operational design. So here we are looking at the techniques that we shall use. Here we talk about methodology. Are we going to use qualitative? Are we going to use quantitative? And so on and so forth. We now go to the area of types of research design. We have basically 4. You may have seen some of these as we are looking at research methods, but they really help us. Our research methods essentially fall under any of these. All our research methods fall under any of these. Let's start with the first one, exploratory or formulative studies. Now, when we are looking at, we may be trying to observe something, a research problem, where there have been very few or no studies have been done on a particular subject. Let me give an example of my own research, which was in the field of mHealth. mHealth and sustainability. Now, according to the literature at that time, there had been very little studies done empirical research studies which had looked at sustainability to really focus on what are those variables within a certain developing context that may affect sustainability. What are those? And so it was an exploratory study which was trying to identify. So from the literature review, it showed that very little had been done, and so essentially it was going out to discover, to explore that particular phenomena. So what an exploratory study basically does is it is trying to gain insight, to gain an understanding, a familiarity about a particular phenomena. So if you remember from our lecture of let's say things like survey or quantitative research, something is known, we are simply trying to prove or disprove a certain theory. But here we essentially we're saying little is known, so we're going out to explore. So in the goals of an exploratory research, one is somebody is trying to gain familiarity, to try to understand. So you will find, let's say like in the goals or objectives, will be something like to determine this, this, and this, to assess, to determine, to examine. Those would be the terms that you'd hear. And the objective then would be to generate new ideas and assumptions. That would be the objective. The other is to develop tentative theories and hypotheses. Now, usually also the exploratory studies are still quite minimal, and you can't make an assertive theory. You can normally, at the end of it, you might say, probably this means this. That's where you might, that's the language you would use. And an exploratory study essentially guides others to say if this study is feasible for anywhere else in the future. I'll give you an example. I had a student in MSc ICT who he was quite fortunate. He was they were applying a community mobile application here in Uganda. Now previously, research in South Africa had done the same and had developed a framework on evaluating the sustainability of these community mobile applications. So what he did, because this research had been done in South Africa, that was a completely different context from Uganda. What he did was to try and validate this framework within Uganda. That he got, as they were applying this community community application, he used the framework to evaluate this the sustainability of this mobile application. So that was the study in South Africa was creating room to study this in Uganda. And somebody else can do the same thing and say, let me also study it in maybe Kenya, in West Africa. And then when another person comes up and says, okay, the research in South Africa observed this, the research in Uganda observed this, the research, can we then develop a theory to say, with community mobile applications, you are sure to have ABCD as an observable variable, which you can then create a theory out of that. So this is the basis. This such kinds of research, exploratory research, essentially creates a basis for one to create those kinds of theories. So what do these kinds of research tell us? As we said earlier, they help one to gain insight, to gain an understanding of a phenomenon that is unknown, Also, exploratory research helps us to answer the questions of what, why, and how. What, how, what, why, and how. It doesn't explain causes of something. We can understand something, we can understand why it's happening and how it is happening, but we may not understand the causes behind it. So this research, like we said, it also helps us to define new terms and clarify new concepts. Yeah. And as we said earlier, it can help us generate formal hypotheses. It helps us generate, but however, keep in point that it is not, it doesn't give a definitive answer. It is a probable answer, a probability answer, where someone says, this probably means this. What do these studies not tell us? Essentially, going back to what I've been saying earlier. Usually because exploratory research really focuses on very small sizes, someone may even focus on one specific context area. You cannot generalize. You can't generalize and say, for example, in my research, I did my research in the area of Mpigi, specifically in a parish called Nindye. Yeah, it was largely qualitative, very intensive 2 years of ethnography research. Now, from what I observed, there's no way I could say all rural areas in Uganda, this is how health workers behave. No, as far as using mobile applications, you can't say that. That sample size is too small. You can't say the same thing. For example, you can't automatically assume the way a health worker in a rural health facility will behave is the same as a health worker in an urban setting. It's not possible to make that assumption. The research process of exploratory studies is quite flexible. Now, it's not the same thing, for example, as survey research. Although you can have an exploratory research, which is survey, but if you have purely quantitative research, where you have a survey, it's quite predetermined. A survey or an experiment, things are quite determined. Things are very, very controlled. But with an exploratory research, because you're trying to discover, there are things that you will find that you were not expecting. I found that was very evident in my research, where I was doing action design science. I designed the first prototype, and when I went into the field, the users were saying, no, this is highly impractical for us. And the design process, the prototype had to change. So when you come to an exploratory research, things change. You can't have the same rigid approach as when you're doing quantitative type of research. Another thing is that when you have exploratory research, you really lack rigorous standards, for example, to validate your work. This, however, does not mean it's not possible to validate exploratory research. It's quite possible to validate your research. I'll give you an example again of my research, where I started largely qualitative. I made some discoveries from observation with the community members. Then what I did at the end, I decided to give out a questionnaire just to validate the existence of certain variables. So I'll just give you an example. During one of my sessions, just sitting down with the community members talked about their lack of mobile literacy skills. So I remember it was one elderly man who mentioned it. So what I did was I carried out a mobile literacy exercise with a huge part of community members, and I gave out a mobile literacy test before and after the training, just to see. And lo and behold, the evidence showed a number of rural community members had very limited mobile literacy skills. A simple thing like checking your SMS, it's something that is unknown, relatively an unknown skill in rural communities. Next is descriptive studies. So the descriptive studies help us to answer the who, what, when, and where. Again, the descriptive study also falls under exploratory studies. They cannot give conclusive answers to situations, but they can help explain further something that is relatively unknown, or it may be known. Actually, essentially, a descriptive study is that you have something that is known, but you need to understand more. Now, with descriptive studies, what a researcher is trying to do is observe a phenomena, a subject, or whatever it is you're studying in a natural environment, a natural unchanging environment. You can gain quite a bit of analyzable data. But again, we want to point out this does not give conclusive answers. Now, with descriptive research, we normally do this. We can use descriptive research to lead to more in-depth quantitative research. So I'll give you an example. One can decide in the field of ICT. You may find somebody can decide to go and say, let's start from exploratory research. We're now in the area of COVID-19 pandemic. We have a number of universities that have now gone and are going online. Some universities are just now going online because we're having the second wave. Somebody may first carry out an exploratory study to try and find out how are universities faring as far as online studying is concerned. Someone may choose a case study of UMU, another may choose a case study of UC, because these are two universities, I think, which have really embraced e-learning. Then that could be an exploratory research. Another one can say, let me even go further and try to understand if all universities, a descriptive research to find out the state of e-learning for all Ugandan universities. That means you're now going public universities, you're going Makerere University, you're going Kabale University, you're going UMU, then you go to the private universities, and you see what the trend is like. That would be the descriptive. Then another one, looking at the descriptive research, may say, I want to go even further to see the effect on performance, and they decide to do quantitative research to see performance of students before online learning, after online learning. What has the effect been? Just doing that kind of study. So, as we stated earlier, descriptive research essentially does not give conclusive answers. So we cannot depend on them to give us conclusive answers. But, however, they can help us lead to more in-depth quantitative research, which can give us conclusive answers. We now come to experimental studies. Now, this type of studies are highly controlled. If you remember our discussion on exploratory research, we said exploratory research can be flexible, but experimental studies are quite different. They're very controlled, and they are basically in an unnatural environment. We've seen experimental studies before when O-level ones we did biology or chemistry. that kind of situation. Let us look. Just have a simple example. Let's say an IS student wants to develop a system using a certain method, which is relatively new in the field, and then wants to test its robustness. Well, this particular student will do so in a controlled environment. And this environment is not the same as the natural environment. For example, if it is put in an organizational setting and you have a novice user using the system, somebody who may be scared, or whatever it is, the experimental study will be highly controlled, unlike an uncontrolled environment. The significant thing, however, about experimental studies is that it is possible to predict the outcome. It is possible to predict the outcome, unlike, let's say, descriptive or exploratory research, where you may not know what the result is going to be. So that's where the major difference is. What does this research, what does it not tell us? Number one, experimental studies do not tell us what causes something to happen. Because what causes something to happen, you need to study something in its natural environment so that you can find out the causality. We shall see in the next study, which is diagnostic. Diagnostic, as it states, you're diagnosing the cause of something, the existence and the cause of something. Experimental research or studies do not give us that insight. Two, because we are studying in a highly artificial environment, we cannot generalize what we have found to other real world contexts. We have already talked about generalization. We know what it means. That means I apply what I've found to what may exist elsewhere. Take an example. If scientists are studying COVID-19 specific variants, how they are affected by certain vaccine, whoever has that particular COVID variant or coronavirus, the particular variant that has been affected, that person will be more protected using this particular vaccine. That can be generalized to all others, all research that is maybe studying a particular variant. If Uganda develops its own variant and develops a vaccine for that variant, you cannot then say this vaccine can then go and cure another vaccine, another variant, let's say found in South Africa or India or anywhere else. So these are some of the shortcomings about experimental design. It can also be quite costly, especially if you need specialized equipment. Just take an example of doing tests on a system. I one time had a discussion with one of the a professor from the Netherlands who at one time worked in the private industry, and he said he worked for a software developing company, and this particular company had different departments. There were those who designed, there were those who implemented. Then there was a department, their job was simply to test, and he said this particular department was hated, absolutely hated by those who designed and implemented. Why? Because their job was to make sure that your system failed. So they would put it under so many rigorous tests, which we may not have here in Uganda. This may be something that we don't have. So one may say it may be a little bit difficult for, let's say, for us to carry out experimental studies, especially in areas of IS. We come to diagnostic studies. So these are studies that essentially try to find out what causes something, and they can be quite in-depth. Now, the thing is that a diagnostic study can be either qualitative or quantitative. I'll give you an example. There are certain phenomena which, even if you went out and gave as many questionnaires, you'll never find out what causes something. Simple. An example is female circumcision. For quite some time in Uganda, the law against female circumcision has existed, but this practice still goes on. And it is particularly pushed forward by women. So one may wonder, why do these women do this, carry out this gruesome act on themselves? Why do they push their daughters, their nieces, their sisters, and even in some cases, some women make a decision to actually carry out this act? Why? This may not be something that you may find out in one interview. Researchers have actually carried out ethnographic research where they go and stay with communities for a long period of time to understand why somebody does something. I'll also give you another example. This is particularly in the area of ICT 4D, where there was a project implemented in a rural area. These donors came and implemented a community radio station, and the purpose of this community radio station was to broadcast periodically information on market prices, weather, and anything to do with farming. In addition, they placed in the village, in the community areas, at certain strategic points, they placed these loudspeakers which would broadcast whatever was being broadcast at the radio station could be broadcast out loud, even whether you had a radio or not. So everyone would get to have this information. So later on, that the donors send in evaluators to try and find out how this project was going. And they found one of the main things they found, that these loudspeakers that had been placed in different parts of the community had been vandalized, had been broken, they had been put down. So when they did the initial exploratory research to find out why, they were told that all those were bad elements in the community. Some youths who were a little bit bad-mannered came and removed them. But as they took more time with the community, they found out it was these very community members who pulled down these machines, this equipment. Why? They got bored. They said they were bored of being constantly told about market prices and so on and so forth. So there was nothing entertaining coming from these radio stations. So they themselves actually it was not bad elements in the community, but the community members themselves, the responsible community members, they are the ones who did it because they were tired of being given information on market prices. They said, at least tell us the latest on these soaps that we watch, on TV, and these Z World, these Indian soaps, and so on and so forth. Give us updates on those. So that was a diagnostic study, which was qualitative in nature. You can have the diagnostic studies quantitative in nature as well, which may look at cross-sectional studies, but you get really huge amounts of data and you try to correlate to see, let us say, just to give you an example, there was a research, there is a project that was started with an organization here in Uganda called Palliative Care Association of Uganda, where they collect monthly data from health facilities on people receiving palliative care. Palliative care is essentially care which is there to relieve pain. But they don't just collect information on how many people have used morphine, but they try to collect information on who is receiving this morphine. And they found out there was a very strong relationship between certain types of cancer and people who have HIV. So you have different types of cancers, and then you have cancers that are certain types of cancer affect people who are HIV positive. Then you also find that people who, let's say, are using, let's say, these who are addicted to certain drugs, especially these who inject, those ones are more prone to skin cancers because they're injecting themselves. So now that one can clearly indicate that there is a causality there. Now that is quantitative data revealing something like this. I thank you for listening, and I hope this has opened up the subject of research design. Um, I have avoided to make this qualitative or quantitative. Some research designs tend to follow very much a quantitative approach, but this would be a little bit misleading. Normally, we normally don't find with our master's students, both IS and ICT, that they are doing largely quantitative research. They try to combine the two. And so some of the things that you'd expect to find in quantitative research, for example, sampling, may not be something that you would find in ICT or IS research. So I hope this has been informative, and it can open up our discussion in next week's lecture. I'm going to open up a discussion forum on Moodle where you can begin posting any questions and thoughts on research design. So I thank you for listening, and I wish you a good weekend.